I'm doing good.
Good.
So, why are we doing this?
That's a great question. Especially with a million podcasts out there.
Yeah.
I'm brand new to this. My sons got me into it. I can only speak for myself. They liked my sermons and they thought that I should reach out to a younger audience, and this is the way. So the concept of woke-free Christianity came to me because I started listening to a few podcasts out there and realized that there's a lot of Christian podcasts and there's a lot of political podcasts, but there's not a lot that are engaging with how the church and the Bible can interact with the narrative of what they call woke. Of course, that's a broad definition that entails a lot of things. So I'm hoping we can hit on a few of those ideas and see how the Christian gospel compares to it.
A lot of people use the term woke these days. What does that actually mean?
It's a great question, and of course it's debated. Woke has been around since antiquity. The Gnostics used it as a spiritual awakening. Paul says awake, O sleeper. So it's been around for a long time. I think the contemporary language of woke is very similar. It's waking up to an idea. The actual genesis, I think, of contemporary woke ideas comes from Marx and Das Kapital. The Communist Manifesto. And he talks a lot there about the proletariat, the working class, having to wake up to the current oppression that they're in. And the oppression comes from the bourgeoisie. And I think that's where it comes from. I mean, obviously, Marx is completely into economics, and that's his whole worldview. This has gone into social issues, gender, sexuality, race. But I think the idea is that somebody is living in kind of the world, and then they awaken to the reality of the truth. Truth is a big thing, and that the world has kind of snowed them. And I think that's where woke comes from. Though people debate this. So I think it comes from anyways. Or what I've heard.
So should we stay woke then?
Well, I mean, of course, Christianity has its own. Here's where narratives clash, right? Christianity has its own idea of being awakened, right? We use the language born again or other metaphors for that. It's that idea that you recognize things as they weren't. So you see things and then you see things differently after, and it changes your worldview. Paradigm shift kind of thing. Okay. And I think that it certainly seems to me that we should recapture the word woke back to a Christian idea, or at least when we use the word woke, we should define it through what through the biblical idea of it, because the biblical narrative is so different, and I think that's part of my passion for this particular podcast is to give people resources when they're engaging it, because in the church now, as you know, both in the evangelical and the quote-unquote progressive churches, this woke ideology has come in, it's seeped in, and it's not biblical. And I would argue that the biblical Christianity is far more good news. It's far better than that. And of course it has similarities, like anything. It has elements of truth. Like obviously the Bible is concerned about racism or sexism or abuse, but it comes at it from such a different angle.
Yeah. So what would you say is like the biggest differentiation between how Christians would use like a proper Christian term of wokeism in the maybe the secular or the worldly term of woke would be?
I think it's been so hijacked. I don't hear Christians using it very much anymore. Bart used to talk a lot about being awakened to Christ, being in a crisis, and then you're in this crisis when you realize that there is a transcendent God, and you become awakened to the world differently. He famously talked about being awakened to this strange world of Scripture, and it is a strange world to this world. I'm not sure we can recapture it. It's become so.
It's gone. It's gone.
It's kind of like the rainbow, The rainbow was such a beautiful symbol of God's grace, and now it's become a symbol of sexual proclivities and appetites.
Yeah, you made a differentiation earlier between like waking, like awake, O sleeper, like from the Christian and secular. Just if someone who's curious, what's the difference between
Yeah, so it's more of a political, obvious emphasis, the Marxism, the idea of being awakened. Um, yeah, what's that famous story about the fish are in the water, and then the fish jumps out of the boat, the one that's been caught, and going, oh man, I'm glad to be back in the water, and the other fish say, what water? Right, so he's been awakened to the fact that there is water. So that would be their argument, is that they realize there is all these injustices in the world, and they had awakened to it, these systemic things that make their whiteness, or they're oppressed because they're not white. You know, white seems to be a big thing right now. So
sorry about that, by the way. Just checking our privilege here.
That's
Two
right.
white guys
Two white guys
in a black room.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny because the truth is, Christianity answers the race question so beautifully, and I think we should hit on that just to start, because you got that incident right recently, and there was a young man. He sounded like, I think he was African American. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. He was in the subway in New York, right? And apparently he had history of mental health, and of course nobody's treating that anymore. But that's a whole other, podcast to have. And somebody put him in a chokehold. I think he was white. He was a Marine, and there was another African American gentleman who came in to help. But they're focusing on, I think he died, right, and from this chokehold. And now it's like, okay, so this is another example of systemic oppression, right? That's that. And if you're woke, that's how you're going to look at it. You know, you have to kind of look at it. And it goes back to long before George Floyd, right? But I think George Floyd was the kind of peak of this kind of worldly view of how to deal with racial injustice, that there's everything in critical race theory, right? Is that everything is underneath it all, is that there's this system that is creating injustice for people of different races. And as soon as you have that, then you end up with this idea of equity. Jordan Peterson often talks about stuff like this. And he's right in the sense of, it's not equality, it's equity. So what it is we need to turn the tables, and we need to give the opportunities to people of different colors. And obviously what happens out of that is more racial tension, I'd argue. Right?
Yeah, I think of that incident too, from what little I've heard of it, is all the types of attacks that have gone on in the subway, and you're regularly on transit, and you hear somebody threaten, and you have to think, am I going to do something about that and protect those that are on the subway too? And I don't know how often it happens anyway, but here it's quite a challenge. The various types of things that happen. I don't know if you can say it on a podcast, and then because those words I think will get removed or banned on a podcast, but all sorts of attacks happen to people on subways.
Sure, and it's always been like that, and it isn't necessarily race-based, but this one was a racial, and when you look at everything through the racial lens, and we have to be honest with ourselves, there is a racial component to our culture. Of course there is. We've been designed it, but the question isn't in Christianity, is there injustice? Of course there is. There's always injustice in everything. I mean, that is the underlying principle of why we needed a savior, right? Yeah. And we still need a savior, is that there is this constant reality. And Christianity does speak to, definitely speaks to bringing justice. But what does that justice look like? And that's where the problem is. And the problem, I think, that underlies these critical race theories is there's a good and a bad, and it's kind of like there's a new piety that's come, and the piety has to be what is still skin color, but it's just a different skin color. So you're now pious just because you have a certain skin color. You're the victim now. You're the abuser, and we're back into Marxism, right? The proletariat is never wrong. The bourgeoisie is always wrong, and
so for the sake of everyone here, what is proletariat?
Proletariat in the Marxist system is the working class. The bourgeoisie are the landowners. They're the ones who own the mills. And of course, this all came during the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't play well now. Most people aren't pure Marxists anymore. Marxism, which is the foundation of much of what we'll talk about, has Marxism and postmodernism have been the two mix. It's been this weird marriage of two ideas that have got us to where we are culturally, which is the foundation of what we call woke ideas. Marxism is not practiced in the sense of most people are not as concerned about the economic realities that they were in the Industrial Revolution, where children were working at 10, and like there was genuine, they were coming off the feudal system, they're coming off the farms, they're coming into cities, and Marx is noting, hey, this is bad, and there's going to be a revolution. And he's not wrong, it was terrible. And the church was wrong back then. It wasn't offering, social help largely. I mean, there were people like the founders of the Salvation Army and stuff that were going right into the inner cities. But you look at the national churches in Europe during that time, they were telling people to just continue to be good because you're going to have this heaven one day. And that's what Marx was railing against, by the way. He was railing against what he should be railing against in some senses. I think he didn't understand what true Christianity should be, but he really wanted that. So what happens is you've got this working class, they've got to wake up and they've got to have a revolution to change things. And one day there'll be this magical time. It's very utopic that there will be this revolution, and all the proletariat will be in control of all the making of the product, and everyone will be happy. And then you've got communism, right? Mm-hmm. The same kind of idea is being transferred with this idea that you've got the new proletariat, say it's black or a woman or transgender or homosexual or something like that. They become the oppressed class.
Okay. And
the oppressive class is whatever that is, the other side, and there needs to be constant. So it's constant battle to get your ends met. It's all based on power.
Okay.
That's the ultimate end of what's going on. What a lot of people don't understand is that's why this will never get resolved. There is no end to this game.
Well, let's try and keep our mics a bit closer. I'm going to try and drown out that lawnmower.
Is there a lawnmower out there? Yeah.
What are the chances of that, hey?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in saying that, like, what does the solution look like? And I guess we're going to be talking about that for a bit, but like the solution in Marxism is gain power and control, I guess, right?
Yeah,
and
a revolution.
Essentially, like take it.
Yeah.
And so from a biblical perspective, what would the solution be?
Right. So the idea of gaining power as an oppressed class is not new. Marxism is just the modern version of it. And so we see in Jesus' day this huge class of people called the Jews who are heavily oppressed. And they have obviously got to the point where they've had enough by the time of Christ. In fact, before then, you've got the Maccabee revolt against the Greeks, against Antiochus Epiphanes. You've got this whole world where this little nation's been controlled.
Just bring the mic closer.
All right.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes. So the whole idea of Christianity is based around the idea of revolution. It actually hasn't changed that much. The idea of gaining power back. And so you have Jesus living in this world where these people called the Pharisees are there and they're working within a system to gain the divine retribution against the oppressor. They want to have a revolution, in other words.
And like in the Jewish mind, who was the oppressor?
The Romans by this time, of course.
Okay.
And they were in exile. They saw themselves as in exile. Even though they were on the land, they weren't in control of the land. And so the oppressor was, of course, Rome and any vassal state that they were using, including, of course, King Herod. And so the general belief was that God, taking out of the Exodus is their story, right? The Exodus is their 1776 or whatever. This is their story they lived out of. Isn't that the year that America became? Yeah. And this is their main narrative. And so in that narrative, we have an oppressive regime through the Pharaoh, and the people are in slavery, and God sends a deliverer and then smites through the plagues the bad guys, and he delivers them. So they're looking for this kind of deliverer in the first century, Second Temple period. And that is called the Messiah. That's the king. And they use all the texts now. Did they cherry pick? Of course. And they also use texts of David beating the Philistines. They had a lot of usage of texts, of stories that had God divinely intervening for the nation. And that's what they were longing for. That's actually why they were so concerned about the law. The law for them was not about going to heaven. That's just not, they didn't care. They actually didn't believe going to heaven was the goal. It was a resurrection life on earth, which was this new political reality where the Messiah would reign in the temple. And so you'll find very little Jewish writing before that about going to heaven, but they're very into keeping this Torah because it marked them out as different from the others. And by doing this, you could defeat, God would come if we obeyed it. I believe the Pharisees used to pray or say that if we obeyed Torah for 7 days, then God will forgive us. That's where the forgiveness of sins, and he'll send his deliverer. So that's who they're waiting for when Jesus comes. And of course, Jesus comes into this world and he's bringing salvation to them, but their salvation is not his salvation. So this is the key. It's not that he didn't recognize there was injustice. He obviously sees that. But he also sees there's injustice within their people itself, that they aren't the good guys, and then there's some bad guys called the Romans, right? And that's the key fault of critical race theory, frankly, is that good and evil doesn't run through race. Good and evil runs through the heart of humanity, every human being. And so when Christ comes, he's coming and he's talking about deliverance, and they can only hear it that way. And they see it as a revolution. Of course, what is his concept? It is not to gain power, right? That is the work of Satan. Satan's offering him power. It's always this idea of sacrifice, of the kingdom to come, that there's a different type of world that isn't based on power. And when he interacts, and we talked about this last Sunday, he interacts with the Syrophoenician woman or the Samaritan woman, or he's interacting with that man who is blind and mute. These are all Gentiles. And he's clearly showing that whatever salvation he's bringing is not tribal, right? It's not going to be one way. And it seems to me very clearly that those who are most tribal are those who are most damned within the narrative, which is ironic. Because we live in a world where people are so tribal, based on race, gender, sexuality. He warns them consistently. And you see the disciples are just as blind, right? Like, they're so worried of offending the Pharisees because the Pharisees are the ones who are going to bring about the revolution, right? Remember, he says, I think you offended them. And Jesus, oh yeah, well, go tell them their father is Satan. Like, it's pretty funny, right? Yeah. It's pretty radical. And I think what happens, and the good news in Christianity is, of course, it gets to the core of our being. It's not something external. And there's always this image. And the Old Testament, of course, they didn't read it well, because the Old Testament is constantly, you see these Gentiles being drawn in. You see this promise of a Gentile, that the salvation's coming for the world, that he's not a tribal God. And Jesus fulfills that. And I think the battle in many of the New Testament letters are frankly based around this racial tension, that there is this tension still within the Jews, especially the diaspora, those living outside of Jerusalem. They are very much living in a world of Rome, and they're having to keep these markers to show, and they're very much into the world of Jews are good, Romans are dogs, pagans, pig eaters, right? And so when you're reading a lot of this stuff, and you see it, especially in Paul's had a radical transformation, right? I mean, in the world of Judaism, if we can use this analogy, he was the top guy. He's the Jew of Jews, he calls himself, right? He's the guy wearing the BLM shirt, right? He's got his Marxist hat. He's got his hair pink or green or whatever. He's wearing the black mask. He's got umbrellas to keep people from knowing. He's that guy. He's going around. He's actually going out to kill Christians because they're Jews that have got it wrong. So he is like the guy. And then he interacts with Jesus. He has this encounter. And who does he become? He becomes the apostle of the Gentiles. It's radical. It's a radical motion. It just shows you how radical Christianity is. He takes the equivalent of an Osama bin Laden and he makes him the apostle to the United States. Like, it's that radical. And I watched a historian once, and he was like, we can't, a secular historian said, we can't explain Paul. Because Paul doesn't make sense. He just doesn't make sense. He's insane. And he's in you got Galatia, and there's Peter, Mr. Peter, who, he's for all his faults, he's buying back into the racial thing, right? In Galatia, and he's starting to eat with his Jewish friends, and he's he's wanting the Gentiles to become Jewish because that's salvation, and of course that's all been shattered because that leads to division. And Paul questions whether he's even a Christian really, and he says, I can't believe how quickly you've been bewitched, he says to the Galatians, right? That this gospel, any other gospel's anathema. And then he goes on, and what's the main theme in Galatians? Salvation by grace alone. Because the problem is that you've got this division again between races. Yeah. And until you get to that point where you are completely the oppressor, we all are, by the way. We are all the oppressor in the sense that we nailed Jesus to the cross. That's the story. The only oppressed one is Jesus Christ. He's the only good person. Then you'll always find a reason. Some markers like circumcision, the reason he's so passionate about it in Galatians is not because he cares about foreskin, whether you remove it or not. It's because that has become a mark of an oppressed group's status over the oppressor. So what I'm saying to people is that the good news in BLM is that somehow you will have a power struggle and you will eventually win and get your rights. The good news in Christianity is that your soul has been saved, that you can now give up your life here and live for the other and who's just been as broken as you. They're very different stories. And one leads to salvation and one doesn't. It's that radical. So yeah, critical race theory, while it points out the problem, it has no solution because there's always going to be a problem. You see what I mean? That's the problem with Marxism. Marxism is popular, by the way, with academics. That's why this stuff came up, is it hit academia because academics gave up Christianity, but they had to have a purpose. Nietzsche couldn't answer that. Nietzsche was just like, do whatever you want, there's no God. And so they found in Marx, no, there is, and it's got the same foundation of Christianity. It's got a problem, right? Ours is original sin or idolatry. Theirs is this economic disconnect. And it also has a solution of salvation, revolution, right? It offers people purpose. So when secular people were going to university, they got purpose from it, even though it doesn't actually work. And who's teaching all the kids that are now wearing these red, totally into this pink hair and all of the radical things? They're people who've studied under Marxists. There's a reason why it's the way it is. It's not actually that complex.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I've seen a few photos, before and after photos of post-secondary studies, and there's something funny there, hey, like with identity and presentation and how you identify yourself and what group you identify yourself with. And I think too, like I just wonder, like looking at the Acts 2 church and how multicultural the church was, when there was no longer a race or didn't matter.
I mean, they're all Jews, but they're all from all the diaspora and by Acts 2, but there's nobody's going up to the world, right? That's the call in Acts 1. I mean, they're speaking different tongues, but they're all Jews because they're in the Passover there. But you're right. I mean, you get this undoing, and that's the whole point. I mean, that's the crazy part of the Gospels that we just don't get now. We just assume it. But when Mark's writing his Gospel, which we're going through, most Jews had no narrative of Gentiles being part of the people of God. And yet it's a centurion says, this is the Son of God. It's a Syrophoenician woman who calls him Lord, the only one. So you see this, and of course you see the leaders of the Jews rejecting him. So my suspicion is that if Jesus came today and ran into Antifa or BLM or anything, they would crucify him just as much. Because he doesn't offer them a solution they want.
Or because he's white.
Yeah, that's right. He's not white. I did see a funny one. There was somebody very radically was putting like pictures of Jesus, how he really looked, and this was the most African looking Jesus, and it was just as bad as a white Jesus. It was just like, I think it's wonderful we don't have an image of him because we would worship that, right? That's just our nature. That's our idolatry. Yeah. Even that, I was at
I heard it's a white man religion. I'm just stating the obvious, right?
Yeah. What's so funny is it's not either. Like, that's another lie. Like, if Christianity's taken off, it's in Asia, Africa, and Central America. It's not in North America. Yeah. We're a secular world now. We just have to come to terms with that. I was laughing. I was going through a garage sale with my wife this weekend, and there's all those junk, and there's so many junk Christian books that people are trying to get rid of. I mean, I must have saw 10 purpose-driven lives You know what I mean? Like books that were big at one time. Anyways, there was this one picture, and it was the whitest Jesus I'd ever seen. It would made me laugh. Blue eyes, blonde hair. Looked like a football player.
That's a stocky Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Super Jesus, like the comic book Jesus.
Well, and so how do you deal with this guy in the, you go back to this situation. There's no easy answers, by the way. My background, I was a social worker. I was in corrections. I worked with young sex offenders. I mean, I've counseled them. There's no easy answers. The world is broken. And this young man, whoever he was, probably was on drugs. I'm sure or at least he maybe was a post-drug psychosis. Who knows? The worst thing we do as a culture is we don't do anything for them. So they get to that point where that situation's going to come up.
Yeah.
And it's become almost, we're so post-Christian in our culture. The idea of helping the needy practically is just almost anathema to the mindset, because that's not your voting class, right? So, when I was working in corrections way back in the day, they closed Riverview. Do you remember Riverview? It was that.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
It was this big mental health facility, and I'm sure there was abuses going on there. But what do you think the mental health people, the challenged people, went out and had a nice life? No, they ended up record suicides, people jumping off bridges, and they ended up in jail because they couldn't exist. And so all of a sudden, instead of having them being dealt with by nurses and physicians that know what they're doing, they've got guys like me handing them their drugs, and they're in solitary confinement because they can't exist. So, I'm not surprised. I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often. Mm-hmm. And of course there's assaults on subways, because they're going to exist in a place where it's highly movable. When I ministered in Wally all those years, the reason they came to Wally was it was the end of the SkyTrain station. They could move, right? Wow. So
yeah, I think too, like on that subject of that man restraining that individual. And unfortunately, he passed away. It's so sad.
Yeah.
I heard another recent story of a young man. He's a wrestler in the States, and I can't remember where. I was trying to find it, but he was able to restrain a man who was trying to attack a woman and child that barricaded themselves in a washroom in a gas station.
Oh wow!
And so there was 3 attendants. They couldn't deal with him, but then this young man walks in and subdues it, like submits him and holds him till the cops come. And that was a good ending to the story.
Yeah, it ended well, right?
Both of them are white. But what would it look like?
Yeah.
Like if that guy didn't, if the man didn't die, right?
Yeah.
Would have been a story. But what about all the heroic deeds that go on daily that you don't hear about because it's not sensational?
Well, it's not sensational. It doesn't fit the narrative. Don't forget, you have to create a narrative. Critical race theory, and we'll talk about others, feminism, sexuality, all of these things. You have to create a narrative, and you have to make sure that everything fits a narrative. So you don't want those stories out there. That's why the media largely, that's the weird part, is that corporate America has embraced this. But I think it's because it sells right now.
Just talk close to your mic, closer to
your mic. So I think it just sells better now.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you've got these people who are being stuck in these situations, and it's pretty rare. Just from a sociological perspective, most of us can take a SkyTrain or a subway, and we're not going to have any. Worst I ever had was a guy threw up on my shoes.
Oh,
yeah,
nasty.
I don't know what race he was. I didn't care.
Yeah,
I was mad. But I think that the underlying thing is, what does the church do then, right? First of all, there's not going to be an easy solution. Come Lord Jesus, right? Revelation. There is that. We have to continue to realize we're not going to solve it through political power. It doesn't work when you get Constantine in. It just becomes. We end up just doing bad things. The whole indigenous issue with the schools, right? Residential schools. That's all because we had power at that time. And if we would have just stayed out of that, obviously there was a bad theology going on, but and we like power, and I'm adamant that that's not our call. So how do we live in communities that aren't racist? Well, it's not going to be there if you go into BLM, because everything's seen through that light. You're not going to end up worshiping with people of different races. You just won't do it. because they represent something.
Yeah.
The only way this gets beaten, and Paul talks about this all the time, is once we realize that we're saved by the blood of Christ alone. And that we're all one. We're all sinners. We're all idolaters. We're all given over to these things. Only in the gratitude of salvation and by the Spirit coming in us that we can begin to live together. And I'm proud of the fact that I ministered by preaching the gospel. We ended up in Wally with a very multicultural church. We had Koreans and Sudanese and the whole swath of different nationalities. And there was never a sense amongst us that there was a hierarchy, because we always had this genuine belief that we're saved by grace alone. And we were also living amongst the poor, so that was, that's what the church was. It wasn't, I think the gospel's the answer, but it's just, I don't think the world's ever going to come up with an answer. The world is going to continue to fight through power, and I think we just have to prepare ourselves for that. And we may even suffer, being that we are white males. Maybe it will come down that we truly become, I don't think we're that overly oppressed right now, to be honest. But I do think, I'm not one of those guys like, oh, we're so oppressed. But I do think that if you go down that track, and give you an example of where this can go, a practical example, why I'm passionate about this, is I had an elder in one of my churches, and he was not Caucasian, and he had been abused, definitely. He suffered some racial bullying as a young man, and he when the George Floyd thing came, you remember that, of course, he really got into that, and he was very much got into the BLM. He kept posting, and he told the story. He was at his reunion, and apparently one of these bullies came up to him, and he literally was obviously upset with himself, with how he had been as a kid. We do stupid things, that he had come to apologize, and he famously said in this post, I didn't empower him by forgiving him. It's like that. And this is an elder, right? And what was interesting is he kept going. So I finally said, sent him a text, one time, and I just said, this is not Christianity. You're gonna have to work this stuff out. But if you're gonna be an elder, because your elder are white people too, and you're just so much anger and hurt. I'm not saying that it's not genuine, but the reality is he lived in this world, and of course I got called a white supremacist, and he
Yeah, you're totally white supremacist.
yeah, he blocked me. I don't care. It wasn't that close. It wasn't that obviously that great a relationship, anyways, because of that. But what broke my heart is that that's the witness of some Christians, and it's not Jesus Christ. You're gonna have to, if you've been abused and oppressed, and we all have by somebody at some point.
Yeah. You
better work it out, because you might see that person for eternity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's a good message for today. When you think where society could be if Christ were at the center of it all. I heard someone say once, the ground around the cross is level. Doesn't matter how much money you have,
So
what you drive, where you live, what your skin color is.
So
we're all one in the Lord, right? And what if that was the narrative for the day? Eh?
Well, and I think we need to think these. One of my beefs about the church, and I know I've said this to you many times, is that they don't think these things through. So I think what they do when they go to the BLM meetings, or when the pastors go, or they start bringing this stuff up, is I think they think they're doing good things, justice. But
giving a voice to somebody who's...
They're giving a voice, and that's all good. But I think Jesus Christ gives a much better voice. And he's the only one who really quiets the power voice. And I think it's not biblically thought through. How does Jesus deal with injustice? Does he actually bring the sword? Does he march and protest, or does he go right in the midst and just love his enemy and be willing to give up his life? That's a very different message. So I'm very critical of the church's response to BLM. I'd like to think that I have the same heart, but I definitely think I have the better answer, not because I'm better, but because I have a better God than the BLM God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the truth.
Yeah.
As Jesus would say, he said he's the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. Everyone has racism in them.
Yeah.
That's that part of idolatry. That's sin.
Racism. Would you classify that racism?
I think
though,
we all
like,
look. I don't know. I think we all look. I mean, obviously, I'm not walking around wishing harm on people for race, but of course, I have probably in my judgments things that I've heard about certain races, and they're stupid and they're ignorant. Of course, they are. And the Spirit of God, at times, thank God I have it, goes, "You're an idiot." You know, like repent and get over it, because you know we're just as broken, and a lot of it's stupid.
Yeah.
I don't receive that either. A lot of people are, you know, one of the powers that people use or have is to label you a racist, and that's part of the package. And the thing is, you don't have to receive that, right? Like, if you're not doing something racist, or you're not, repent. If you got racist thoughts or something goes across, then it probably will.
Yeah.
Repent, of course. But if somebody says, "Oh, you're white, you're racist," like, just, that's a power move. That's putting you into a situation. And by the way, same with homophobia or transphobic. Like, it's an ignorant attack to label you so you can be dismissed. Yeah. It's not an intellectual one, and it's certainly not Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder, like people have different preferences, right? Like, there was some backlash on some people in not wanting to date transitioned individual. It's like, if you're not going to date somebody,
then you're
transphobic, right? And it's like, well, people can have their preferences, right? Some people like people of different nationalities and different skin colors, and they get married and have little babies.
That's not racism. Racism is when you take somebody of a different skin color and you suppress them or repress them based on that.
Right. Right, but you can have preferences, and that's not racist. I think sometimes people get over worked up. It's like, I think I'm racist because and it's like, hold on a second, you can have preferences.
Right? I mean, I got some white people I don't like being around.
Yeah, no doubt.
I much prefer to be around other people of different races at times.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I don't know. I understand too that there are systems that we have to look at. Like, of course, there have been systems. As Christians, we should be aware of that. But remember, we're not here to change the world. God's done that through the cross. Our job is to witness to what a community can look like. We are. Paul describes us as being just kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Resident aliens, right? We're like this little community in the midst of pagan world to highlight the light. And the question is, of course, when you see racism in the church or sexism or something, then that's really what we need to deal with.
Absolutely.
But when we're dealing, we need a good news for people, both of every color, to say, you know what, you're safe here, you're welcomed here, you're valued here because of Jesus Christ, not because of your skin color, or nor will you be oppressed. I think that can be the greatest witness in a world where you can see the anger coming too. You see the backlash. That's what's scaring me too, is you've got this BLM, but I'm also seeing this white backlash now. Yeah. And that is just as bad. Yeah. There's this thing going around called Christian nationalism. That scares me. You know. Yeah,
the reaction can be a scary thing.
Yeah.
Too, but it's.
And we need to stand against that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that some of the young men, the super straight movement that was I think last year.
What was it called?
Young men think super straight. It's
super
like
straight?
I like men. Pardon me. I like women.
Yeah.
That are born women, and I'm attracted to women that are born women.
And they started a movement called Super
Straight. I think they had a flag and everything.
That's
they got shut down.
That's a reaction.
It's a reaction, but it's them saying, I don't want to be that person anymore. Stop telling me I'm bad, or I can't have these. That's who I am. I want to be invited.
Yeah, we need a community where it's okay to be and follow Christ, and we don't need to call ourselves Super Straight.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like
all these reactions. Hey,
there's lots of reactions.
Like even for being white, it's like, can you say you're proud to be white without triggering people? Yeah. It's like, you know what, it's an interesting idea to bring up.
Yeah, like that wasn't there a movement called All Lives Matter for a while, and then it was like a racist thing.
Yeah, how dare you?
I hate to break it to you, but Jesus was into all lives.
Yeah,
He died for for God so loved the what?
World?
Black people.
Oh wait, just the few
oppressed?
people.
No,
Yeah.
the world, the cosmos, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I understand that they took it that way, but that shows you that this is a divisive thing. You can't be friends, and that's why it's not Christian. And it's been around since Israel. Like I'm saying, way before Israel.
Mm-hmm.
You've got this, and there's this tension, and I would argue that much of the New Testament is written in light of what we're seeing right now. That's why it preaches so well, you know. Yeah. And when you get that Revelation picture, it's such an amazing picture. They're at the throne, and you got the the Lamb that's slain, and who is around there? A multitude, countless of all nations, colors, genders, everything.
Hey, that doesn't work with it's a white man religion though.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's the thing, and I think what happens with people who get involved in this too heavily is they lose their salvation. And you know what I mean? I don't think that they want to be in a kingdom where they're enemies. That's why you have to forgive, right? Because like Jesus is very clear, if you don't forgive, you're not going to be forgiven. But the point being is you're living outside the narrative of who God is. You're not going to bear his image. He's a forgiving person. And you're going to live in an eternity with people that have hurt you. And you have to decide. I think you become like the older brother in the prodigal son parable. You don't want to go in because the guy who blew it is in there. And you're living in your just and mighty and pietist little world. I haven't found a person who's into BLM that I've liked. And by the way, most of the people I've met in BLM or into that are white. They're white, middle-class women. I'm just shooting straight. It's I just find it so funny too, like the virtue signaling on this stuff. Put a little black thing on your. Oh, there you go. Now I'm holy.
You've done your part. You fixed
it. I got
all.
my fist up there, or I got my Ukrainian flag, or I laughed. I had a friend at a union, and he goes, they have this union, and when they have their meetings, they always announce that we're on the unceded land of the, I don't know, name the tribe, right? And we were just laughing. Of course you do that, because it doesn't cost you anything. If you really, really wanted to be into this
give
stuff,
it back.
Give them the land. Give them the land. Give them back.
Yeah, just
they
give it
don't.
back.
It's all. That's the other thing. It's all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
Nobody's actually doing anything. And what's with the BLM burning down black neighborhoods? You notice they're not going down into Tennessee.
Yeah. Yeah, that happened with the race riots back in the 70s too. Just destroyed black communities.
And then it's unfortunate, and the church needs to get down there and preach the gospel. And I look forward to hearing stories of my black brethren who are ministers going down there and preaching the actual gospel. I don't know what's being preached. I'm sure there are some doing an amazing job talking about this, but I know there's a side of the church now that's really into this and very virtuous in it, and they're destroying their flock. I truly believe that. It's that serious.
Yeah, not everyone can be right, eh? Like with the concept of truth and what the church should be at this time is, there's lots of conflicting ideologies against Christianity right now, and they can't be all true. Yet as Christians, we wouldn't say you're not welcome.
Right.
But what you believe is
wrong,
in conflict as to what we believe. So
how
do we
didn't have any trouble with saying that.
Move forward? Wrong. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And you have to be willing to. People come here and they say, "Oh, I can't believe you tackle these issues." You have to. You have to tackle these issues. This is what's going on today, and we've got such good news that people can get involved in. So
awesome.
Yeah, next week, what are we going to talk about?
I don't know.
We will talk about why don't we do gender next week?
I thought we talked about it all today already, didn't we?
Let's do gender. Gender next week.
Hmm.
We want to talk about the good news of Jesus vis-a-vis, third wave feminism. Hopefully, because that's another one that's destroying people.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little tip. Did you know that you're much more likely to get divorced if you're a feminist?
What?
Yeah.
I've heard women with college degrees that.
Well, because I guess where they learn it.
Yeah, 90%, up to 90%.
Yeah. And unfortunately, again, Christians have such a great story. We can talk about gender, and we will. And that's just such a bad story. So let's do it next week.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Okay.
See you.